Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Pastime Mysteries. Today's episode takes place in New York, 1950 at West Point. Richard Cox vanished without a trace, and there are some very strange aspects regarding the case. I will try to do my best to uncover. Also, side note, thanks for all the support on the recent videos. We are almost at 900 subscribers, and I just want to say thank you guys. Stay tuned for another video this week. Anyway, let's get started. Richard C. Cox was born on July 28, 1928, in Mansfield, Ohio. He was the youngest of 6 to parents, Rupert and Min Cox. His father, unfortunately, died when Richard was only 10 due to a diabetic condition that had gone untreated since the Coxes were practicing Christian Scientists. The Church of Christian Science does not view disease as a physical disorder, but instead as a mental disorder, and it is encouraged that the sick should be treated by a specific prayer instead of medicine. Following Richard's father's death in 1938, Richard's mother operated the family business named Rupert F. Cox Insurance Agency. Richard went through public schooling in Mansfield and later graduated from Mansfield Senior High School in 1946. Although Richard didn't play on any of the school sports teams, he was the president of his sophomore class, the sports editor for the yearbook, an intramural athlete, a member of the high school YMCA, and a member of the National Honor Society. As a teenager, Richard worked full-time during the summers. During this time, he endured a cut to his arm, and when he went home to his mother for help, she refused to obtain medical assistance due to her Christian Science beliefs. When the cut got infected, a neighbor took him to a doctor. Richard's cut healed, but he sustained a prominent scar from the incident. After graduating high school, Richard volunteered for the U.S. Army. He went through basic training at Fort Knox and Camp Atterbury for initial processing. After that, he was sent to the United States Constabulary, where he rose to the rank of sergeant while performing security and police occupation tasks in an American occupation zone in Germany. He started serving with Troop C, 6th Constabulary Squadron, in the American-occupied German zone of Coburg in May 1947. Later on, he was posted to Headquarters Company, 6th Squadron, where he was employed in the S-2 Intelligence Division. When the 6th Squadron disbanded, Richard was posted to Schweinfurt's Troop D, 27th Constabulary Squadron. Richard was a basketball fan, and while in Germany, he played guard on his unit's intramural teams. Richard was appointed to West Point later in 1947, and in January 1948, he enrolled at the United States Military Academy Preparatory School, which was then housed at Stewart Field. Ernest Shotwell was one of his prep school classmates. Shotwell went on to become a valuable source on Richard's disappearance after he gave an eyewitness account indicating that Richard had voluntarily vanished and was purposefully avoiding contact with his family. Richard entered West Point in May 1948 and performed well academically and was ranked about 100th out of 550 students. He also took part in extracurricular activities, including West Point's cross-country running team. Richard was engaged to Betty Timmons, and they planned on getting married when Richard graduated from West Point. Now, with all that being said, let's get into his disappearance. On Saturday, January 7th, 1950, at 4:45 p.m. Peter Haynes, Richard's fellow West Point peer, was in the position of charge of quarters in Cadet Company B2, and he handled phone calls on behalf of the company's members. He reported that a man had called for Richard when he wasn't around. He later said the caller's, quote, tone was rough and patronizing, almost insulting. After Haynes told the man that Richard was not in his room, the man replied, quote, "Well, look, when he comes in, tell him to come on down here to the hotel. Just tell him George called. He'll know who I am. We knew each other in Germany. I'm just up here for a little while, and tell him I'd like to get him a bite to eat." Haynes later stated he could not be completely certain the name given was George, as he had answered many phone calls while on duty, and that one had not seemed noteworthy at the time. A man came into Grant Hall, where cadets could meet visitors, at 5:30 p.m. and asked to see Richard. Richard received a call from the duty cadet informing him that he had a guest. The cadet later reported that the visitor was approximately 185 pounds and slightly under 6 feet. He wore a trench coat with a belt, but he didn't wear a hat. He also had fair hair and skin. Richard shook hands with the man as he entered the hall, and the on-duty cadet later recalled he seemed happy to see him. Richard signed out in the Company B2 departure book, indicating he will be having dinner off campus later that night. He had to report to formation an hour after his visitor came, but Richard changed the military time he had entered in the departure book later that evening from 1923 to 1823 to make it appear as though he had attended the 6:30 p.m. cadet supper formation, even though he skipped it, which if he was caught, he could have been charged with violating the Cadet Honor Code. When a U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Command agent had the departure book examined in a laboratory 2 years later, that detail was finally found. Richard admitted later when he returned to his roommates that they did not go out to dinner, but instead drank from a bottle of whiskey while sitting inside the man's parked car. Richard returned to Cadet Company B2, and after checking into the departure book and taking a shower, he wanted to get some rest to recover from his alcohol hangover. He was slouched over his desk, sleeping, and his friends would take embarrassing prank photos of him. Richard told his roommates about his guest the following morning, before heading to the Sunday chapel service. The man was a former U.S. Army Ranger who had been with the same unit that he had been in Germany. According to Richard, the man took great pride in slicing off the private parts of German soldiers, and even boasted about killing them during the war. He is also reported to have told him a story about getting a German girl pregnant and then killing her to stop her from giving birth. Richard signed out again for the meeting with the man that afternoon, and he returned at roughly 4:30 p.m. Nothing happened for the next 6 days. Richard did mention his visitor once to his roommates, saying that he, quote, hoped he wouldn't have to see the fellow again, which gave them the impression he didn't have a good time with him. Richard went to see Army versus Rutgers University basketball on Saturday, January 14th, 1950. Later on, he was observed talking to a man believed to be George, but the cadet who witnessed the two had a very different account from the cadet who had seen the stranger on January 7th in Grant Hall. George was described as rough-looking and dark-haired by the 14th of January eyewitness. Once back in his room, Richard told a roommate that he was signing out to have dinner with his guest once more, but he looked, quote, not apprehensive, just sort of disgusted. The two men left the academy, and both Richard and George were never seen again. Richard was supposed to be back by 11 p.m., but since cadets sometimes returned late, no one was alarmed when he did not show up. At around 2:30 a.m., his continued absence was brought to the attention of a higher-ranking officer. However, as cadets were known to remain out late into the night, even though it would result in consequences, no action was taken. His roommates informed their supervisor of everything they knew about the situation early on Sunday morning, and both the CID and the New York State Police were notified. The FBI joined the investigation as well. A public request for information was broadcast on local radio stations 3 days after Richard vanished. Both ground troops and helicopters thoroughly searched the West Point grounds. A neighboring pond was emptied, the Lusk Reservoir was dragged, and the Hudson River's banks were examined. Despite the 2-month duration of the manhunt, no noteworthy leads were found. Almost without fail, a search of Army records for a soldier who served with Richard and fit the description of George turned up names of people who were not at West Point when the missing person disappeared. An investigation into Cox's service in Germany turned up nothing. The idea that he had purposefully left was discounted as he left behind $87 and 2 suits of civilian clothes, even though he had occasionally written derogatory letters to his mother and girlfriend about life at West Point. Richard was noted as absent without leave on March 15, 1950. The FBI investigated Richard's potential sexual orientation as gay or bisexual, based on a theory put forth by a psychologist at West Point. Part of this investigation involved going to gay bars in New York City with his roommates to see if anyone recognized someone as George, or if any of them knew Richard. The roommates never saw anyone who resembled George, and nobody had seen Richard. Richard's friends and family dismissed the rumors regarding his sexual orientation, despite a third-hand account from a Mansfield store employee claiming to have seen Richard and another man having sex in the store's basement in 1946. Ernest Shotwell, who was now in the U.S. Coast Guard, told the FBI in 1954 that he had spoken with Richard in 1952, 2 years after he vanished, at the Greyhound Line's bus station in Washington, D.C. Shotwell assumed Richard was no longer missing, even though he was aware of his absence from West Point when he saw him at the bus station. Shotwell claimed that Richard had said he resigned from West Point and that he was moving to Germany during their meeting at the bus station. Shotwell claimed that Richard was uneasy, evasive about his intentions, and departed after just 5 minutes. By the late 1950s, the FBI considered the investigation closed, and Richard's family had him declared legally dead in 1957. Even though the FBI maintained that it had no more leads to follow, it continued to investigate sporadic tips. One of these was a 1960 sighting of Richard that was reportedly reported by an FBI informant who stated that he had spent time with a man he later identified as Richard at a Melbourne, Florida bar. The man went by R.C. Mansfield, but his friends referred to him as Richard. Following a lengthy conversation at the bar, Mansfield allegedly divulged to the informant personal information that matched Richard's and disclosed that Cox was his real name. This case was thoroughly investigated by a retired history teacher named Marshall Jacobs, and he has discovered some interesting things within the case I feel is crucial to share. Jacobs spent a decade diving deep into the case, traveling the country to pursue fresh leads and re-examine previous ones. He conducted interviews with CIA, FBI, and CID agents, including Frank Sturgis, the star of the Watergate scandal, other West Point and Army officials, as well as Richard's family, high school friends, military friends, and West Point classmates. Using the Freedom of Information Act, he was able to access the files from the FBI, CIA, and CID investigations into Richard's disappearance, and he used them to research West Point's archives. One of Jacobs's conclusions was that the authorities were mistaken in rejecting the possibility that Richard had run away on purpose. Jacobs also came to believe that the presence of $87 in Cox's shared room did not rule out the possibility that his visitor had helped him start a new career with a new identity. Among the old leads Jacobs re-examined were those from Jim Underwood, a reporter for the Mansfield News Journal, who had produced a 12-part series on the Richard Cox mystery for the News Journal in 1982. Underwood had spoken with Ralph E. Johns, a prosecutor and Army veteran who had been a judge in Mansfield and a high school friend of Richard's. Underwood was informed by Johns that while he was not a part of the initial probe in the 1950s, he and County Prosecutor William McKee were keeping tabs on local FBI agents and were intrigued by Richard's case. Johns also told Underwood that after talking to former FBI agent Vince Napoli about Richard, Napoli stated the FBI had previously been close to obtaining Richard and could not understand why higher-ups at the agency would not allow agents to pick him up. Johns conjectured, potentially drawing from Napoli's account, that Richard may have joined a covert government organization like the CIA. Even though Jacobs was unable to provide a conclusive answer for Richard's disappearance, he did come up with what he thought was a likely explanation. Jacobs established that the soldier Richard served in Germany with, David M. Westervelt, a resident of northern New Jersey, was the alleged George. Westervelt had a questionable career that led to multiple police interviews regarding Richard's disappearance, and he matched the physical description given by Richard's classmates. Jacobs believed that Westervelt was a CIA recruiter, something his family didn't discount. Jacobs believed that Richard admitted unhappiness with West Point during Westervelt's first visit, and that during the subsequent visits, Westervelt offered Cox a way out by helping him start a new life under a different name and a career with the CIA or another intelligence agency. In the mid-1990s, a retired CIA official who wished to remain anonymous gave Jacobs an account of how Richard joined a stay-behind team in Europe and worked for years to smuggle Russian nuclear scientists and other high-priority individuals out of the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries. He also told Jacobs that Reichard retired in northern Idaho, but at the time of their interview, he was hospitalized. Jacobs then believed that Richard died at the National Institutes of Health facility in Bethesda, Maryland, in the mid-1990s. What do you guys think? Did Richard run away and start a new life and live happily ever after? Or did something else way more sinister happen? You guys let me know what you think in the comments. This is a confusing one. It seems like there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that he survived, although all of Jacobs' theories are speculation, and he did cover this case for 10 years. I hope you guys enjoyed this coverage of it, because I enjoyed researching it. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please leave a like and subscribe. Comment what you think and what case should be next. As always, see you next time.